Sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest miracles. In the shadows of towering skyscrapers, where wealth and poverty dance their eternal waltz, an 80-year-old girl with torn shoes and boundless hope approaches a wheelchair-bound billionaire. Her innocent request will shatter his world of cynicism, revealing that true healing comes not from medicine, but from the purest form of human connection imaginable. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Wellington's penthouse office, each droplet creating rivulets that traced lazy paths down the pristine glass like tears. The sky refused to hold back any longer. The rhythmic percussion should have been soothing, perhaps even meditative, but to Marcus it sounded like nature's cruel reminder that the world kept moving, kept weeping, kept living, while he remained trapped in this wheeled prison of his own making. He sat motionless behind his mahogany desk, fingers absently tracing the edges of quarterly reports that painted pictures of unprecedented success. Wellington Industries had never been more profitable, never more influential in the market. The numbers should have filled him with pride, with satisfaction, with something resembling contentment. Instead, they felt as cold and lifeless as his legs had felt every morning for the past 3 years. 2 months and 16 days since the accident that had changed everything. The accident. Even now, Marcus could bring himself to think about that rainy Tuesday morning when his world had tilted on its axis and never quite righted itself again. The screech of brakes, the sickening crunch of metal. The moment when darkness swallowed everything he thought he knew about his life. When he'd awakened in the hospital weeks later. The first thing he'd noticed was onto the pain or the tubes, or even the concerned faces of doctors and nurses hovering around his bed. It was the profound, devastating silence from his lower body, a silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. 3 years of the finest physical therapists money could buy, 3 years of experimental treatments and cutting-edge procedures, 3 years of hope systematically crushed by the cold clinical reality that some things couldn't be fixed no matter how many zeros appeared on your bank balance. Marcus had learned that wealth could buy many things. The best wheelchairs, the most comfortable adjustments to his penthouse, the most skilled caregivers, but it could buy back the simple joy of feeling sand between his toes, or the satisfaction of a morning jog through Central Park. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with his presence, who had sealed multi-million-dollar deals with a handshake and a smile, had become a shadow of himself. His thick dark hair, once meticulously styled, now hung limply across his forehead. His eyes, which had once sparkled with ambition and determination, had taken on the dull sheen of resignation. The expensive suits still hung perfectly on his frame, tailored to accommodate his new reality, but they felt like costumes now, elaborate disguises for a broken man playing at being whole. His penthouse office on the 42nd floor had become both his kingdom and his prison. From here he could see the entire city sprawling beneath him like a living, breathing organism. Tiny figures moved along the sidewalks far below, each one a story, a life, a collection of dreams and disappointments that Marcus no longer felt connected to. Sometimes he would spend hours at this window watching the world continue, its relentless march forward while he remained suspended in time, neither fully living nor completely surrendering to the darkness that whispered temptations in his ear during the loneliest hours of the night. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd never been more successful in business terms. Perhaps it was because work had become his only refuge, the one area of his life where his disability didn't matter. His mind, at least, remained sharp, calculating, ruthless. When it needed to be, he could still read markets, anticipate trends, make the kind of strategic decisions that kept Wellington Industries at the top of its game. But success without purpose, without someone to share it with, without the ability to truly enjoy the fruits of his labor, felt hollow and meaningless. A soft knock interrupted his brooding, the sound barely audible above the rain's steady rhythm. The knock was tentative, almost apologetic, so different from the confident raps that usually preceded visits from his executives and business partners. "Sir, there's a situation downstairs." His assistant stammered through the intercom, her voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty that immediately caught Marcus's attention. Margaret had been his assistant for 7 years, had weathered the storm of his accident and the difficult months that followed with unwavering professionalism and quiet compassion. She'd learned to navigate his moods, to know when he needed space, and when he needed gentle prodding to engage with the world beyond his office walls. For her to sound this flustered was unusual enough to pierce through his fog of self-absorption. Marcus wheeled away from his desk, the motion smooth and practiced now after years of adaptation. The wheelchair had cost more than most people's cars, a feat of engineering that responded to his every movement with precision and grace. It was a beautiful machine, he supposed, if one could find beauty in the instrument of their confinement. The irony of owning the most advanced mobility device money could buy while feeling more trapped than ever was unlost on him. He approached the window overlooking the plaza, pressing a button that controlled the smart glass, shifting it from its normal transparency to a slight magnification that allowed him to see the street level with perfect clarity. The plaza below was mostly empty, the rain having driven most pedestrians to seek shelter in the building's lobby or nearby shops. But there, standing beside his building's entrance like a small sentinel against the storm, was a figure that made him lean forward in his chair. It was a child, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. She wore a faded pink coat that had seen better days, the kind of coat that spoke of careful budgeting and hand-me-downs rather than shopping sprees at expensive boutiques. The coat was too big for her small frame, hanging loosely around her shoulders, and Marcus could see that it was soaked through from the rain. Her hair, dark and curly, was plastered to her head, and yet she stood there with a posture that suggested determination rather than defeat. In her small hands, she clutched a brown paper bag, holding it close to her chest, as if it contained the most precious treasure imaginable. The bag was getting wet, starting to lose its structural integrity at the corners, but she didn't seem to notice or care. Security guards hovered nearby, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Marcus recognized them as part of his building's excellent security team, men trained to deal with corporate espionage, hostile takeovers, and aggressive protesters. But a small rain-soaked child standing peacefully by their entrance had apparently not been covered in their training manual. "She's been there for 2 hours," his assistant continued, her voice now carrying a note of sympathy that Marcus found both touching and irritating. "Says she won't leave until she speaks with you personally. She's just a child, sir. The guards don't know what to do. They can't exactly remove her by force, and she's not causing any trouble. She's just ... waiting 2 hours. Marcus felt something twist in his chest as he looked down at the small figure below. 2 hours in the rain, waiting for a chance to speak with a man she'd never met, holding on to whatever was in that paper bag with the kind of faith that Marcus had forgotten existed in the world. There was something about her stillness, her patient determination, that reminded him of qualities he'd once possessed, but had lost somewhere in the wreckage of his accident. Curiosity overrode irritation, though Marcus told himself it was simply the most efficient way to resolve the situation and return to his work. "Bring her up," he said into the intercom, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. It had been months since he'd agreed to see anyone who was untaught his carefully managed calendar. "Sir, are you certain? She's not. That is, she doesn't appear to be." "I know what she appears to be," Marcus said, cutting off his assistant's delicate attempt to point out that their visitor did unfit the usual profile of people granted access to the executive floors. "Bring her up, and Margaret, have someone bring towels." The minutes that followed felt strangely suspended in time. Marcus found himself actually nervous, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. What could a child possibly want with him? Was this some kind of elaborate scheme, a publicity stunt orchestrated by one of his competitors or critics? The cynical part of his mind, the part that had grown larger and more dominant since his accident, whispered that nothing was ever as innocent as it seemed. But even as these doubts swirled through his thoughts, he couldn't shake the image of that small figure standing resolute in the rain, clutching her paper bag like a lifeline. There had been something in her posture, something in the way she'd waited without complaint or dramatics, that spoke to a kind of integrity Marcus rarely encountered in his business world. The elevator chimed softly, and Marcus heard the whisper of doors opening, followed by quiet voices in his outer office. Margaret was speaking in the gentle tones she reserved for children and elderly visitors, the kind of voice that made people feel welcomed rather than processed. There was a younger voice responding, clear and confident despite its obvious youth, asking polite questions about the building and expressing wonder at the view from the 42nd floor. Then came the soft knock on his door, different from the earlier intercom summons. This knock carried with it the weight of anticipation, of a moment that felt somehow significant in ways Marcus couldn't yet understand. "Come in," he called, wheeling his chair to face the door directly. He wanted to observe this child from the moment she entered, to try to read her intentions and understand what had driven her to spend 2 hours in the rain, just for a chance to speak with him. The door opened, and Margaret stepped aside to allow their visitor to enter. Marcus's first impression was of how small she seemed in the vast expanse of his office, how the expensive marble floors and towering bookshelves seemed to dwarf her tiny frame. But his second impression, the one that lingered and began to chip away at his cynicism, was of her eyes. 80-year-old Zara Johnson had eyes that held depths Marcus hadn't expected to find in someone so young. They were dark brown, almost black in the office lighting, and they carried a mixture of determination and innocence that made Marcus shift uncomfortably in his wheelchair. These weren't the eyes of a child who had been coached or manipulated into this encounter. These were the eyes of someone who had made her own decision to be here, who had something to say and intended to say it regardless of the intimidating surroundings. Water dripped steadily from her coat onto his marble floors, each drop creating a small, spreading circle that would normally have had Marcus calling for housekeeping. Instead, he found himself oddly fascinated by the sound, by the way she stood there completely unself-conscious about the mess she was making in his pristine office. Her hair was still damp, curling slightly at the edges, as it began to dry, and her clothes beneath the oversized coat were clearly worn but clean, speaking of a family that took pride in their appearance, even if resources were limited. She looked around the office with the wide-eyed wonder that Marcus remembered from his own childhood visits to impressive buildings, but there was no intimidation in her gaze, no shrinking back from the obvious displays of wealth and power that surrounded her. Instead, she seemed to be taking it all in, processing it. perhaps comparing it to whatever world she'd come from to reach this moment. "You're the rich man who can't walk," she said, matter-of-factly, her voice carrying no judgment, no pity. Just a simple statement of observed fact that somehow managed to cut through all the careful euphemisms and diplomatic language that usually surrounded discussions of his condition. The directness of her statement caused his security team to tense visibly. Marcus could see them from his peripheral vision, shifting slightly, hands moving instinctively toward positions that would allow them to intercept any perceived threat. But there was no threat in this child's words, only an honesty so pure it was almost shocking in its simplicity. "That's one way to put it," Marcus replied dryly, finding himself oddly appreciative of her straightforward approach. So many people danced around his disability, using careful phrases like differently abled or mobility challenged, as if the right words could somehow soften the reality of his situation. This child had seen through all that diplomatic language to the essential truth underneath. He studied her face as she stood there, still clutching her paper bag, and he realized she was studying him in return. There was intelligence in her gaze, a quick assessment that reminded him of the kind of rapid evaluation he might make when meeting a new business partner. But unlike his business dealings, there was no calculation in her eyes, no attempt to determine what advantage might be gained from this encounter. "What do you want?" he asked, falling back on the directness she seemed to prefer. The question hung in the air between them for a moment, and Marcus watched as something shifted in her expression. Her small hands tightened slightly on the paper bag, and she took a half-step closer to his desk. The movement was subtle but significant, a crossing of some invisible boundary that separated the formal distance of their initial interaction from something more personal, more meaningful. Zara opened her paper bag with the careful reverence of someone unveiling a sacred treasure. The paper rustled softly, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet office where even the rain had momentarily paused its percussion against the windows. From the bag, she withdrew half of a peanut butter sandwich, wrapped in what appeared to be a piece of wax paper that had been used and reused until it was soft with handling. Beside it, she placed an apple that was small and slightly bruised, the kind that might be found in a discount bin or received from a food pantry. The sight of this simple meal laid out on his expensive desk created a contrast so stark it was almost surreal. The sandwich had been cut with obvious care, the edges neat despite the humble bread and simple filling. The apple, despite its imperfections, had been polished until it gleamed, someone's attempt to present their offering with dignity and pride. "My mama says you have everything but can't be happy," she said, her voice carrying the kind of wisdom that Marcus associated with much older souls. She paused, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him feel as if she were looking straight into his heart, past all the walls he'd built, past all the bitterness and resignation he'd wrapped around himself like armor. "I don't have much," she continued, gesturing toward her simple offering, "but I got joy." The words were spoken with such quiet confidence that Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, some barrier he had uneven realized he'd deconstructed beginning to fracture under the weight of her innocent certainty. She studied his face with the kind of attention that made Marcus feel transparent, as if this child could see through his expensive suit and impressive office to the broken man hiding underneath. Her gaze wasn't judgmental or pitying, it was simply observational, the way a scientist might study an interesting specimen, trying to understand what made it tick. "Want to trade?" she asked finally, her voice carrying a note of hope that Marcus hadn't heard directed toward him in years. "My leftovers for your miracle." The question landed in the silence of the office like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in ways Marcus couldn't have anticipated. A trade. This child who had stood in the rain for 2 hours, who had somehow convinced his security team to let her pass, who had made her way to the 42nd floor of one of the city's most exclusive buildings, wanted to trade half a peanut butter sandwich and a bruised apple for his miracle. Marcus couldn't help it. Laughter erupted from him, but not the kind of laughter that accompanied joy or amusement. This was the harsh, bitter sound of a man who had lost faith in the possibility of miracles, who had spent 3 years learning that some things couldn't be fixed no matter how much money you threw at them. The sound filled the silent office, bouncing off the walls and windows before settling into the space between them like a physical presence. "Child," he said, the laughter still coloring his voice with its bitter edge, "if I could buy a miracle, don't you think I would have by now?" The words came out harder than he'd intended, carrying with them all the frustration and disappointment of 3 years spent hoping against hope, 3 years of treatments that didn't work and specialists who couldn't help, 3 years of slowly accepting that some doors once closed would never open again. He saw his security team exchange glances, perhaps preparing to step in if he became too harsh with their young visitor, but Zara didn't flinch. She didn't step back or look away or show any sign of being intimidated by his bitter laughter or the edge in his voice. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, the gesture reminding Marcus of a bird considering a particularly interesting puzzle. Her eyes never left his face, and in them he saw something he hadn't expected. Compassion, not pity, not fear, but genuine compassion for his pain, even as he'd just dismissed her offering with cruel laughter. "Maybe," she said softly, her voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to wrap around his harsh words and somehow soften them. "You've been looking for the wrong kind of miracle." The simple statement hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt the laughter die in his throat. There was something in her tone, something in the way she continued to look at him with those wise, dark eyes, that suggested she understood more about miracles than he'd given her credit for. This wasn't just a child offering to share her lunch. This was someone who had something to teach him, if he could find the humility to listen. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Wellington found himself truly curious about another person's perspective on hope, on healing, on the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he'd been looking for answers in all the wrong places. The rain resumed its gentle drumming against the windows, but now it sounded less like tears and more like applause, as if the sky itself was encouraging him to pay attention to this unexpected teacher, who had appeared in his office carrying nothing more than half a sandwich and the kind of faith he'd forgotten existed in the world. But Zara didn't flinch at his cynicism. The harsh laughter that had filled the office moments before seemed to bounce off her like raindrops on a well-worn coat, leaving no mark, creating no wound. Where others might have stepped back, intimidated by the bitter edge in his voice or the obvious wealth gap that separated their worlds, she remained perfectly still, her dark eyes never wavering from his face. There was something almost supernatural about her composure, as if she possessed an inner shield forged not from privilege or protection, but from something far more powerful, an unshakable faith in human goodness that even his most caustic laughter could unpenetrate. Instead of retreating, she took a step closer than another. Each movement was deliberate but gentle, like someone approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. Her small feet made barely a whisper against the marble floor, and Marcus found himself holding his breath, watching this tiny figure navigate the vast expanse of his office with a confidence that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within her soul. Her small hand reached toward his wheelchair, but she paused just short of touching it, her fingers hovering in the air like a question mark. "Can I?" she asked, and there was something in her gentle tone that cut through all his defenses more effectively than any argument or plea could have done. The question was simple, just 2 small words, but they carried within them a universe of respect and understanding that Marcus hadn't encountered in years. Not since his accident had anyone asked permission to touch his wheelchair, to enter his personal space. Most people either avoided it entirely, pretending it didn't exist, or treated it as an extension of his body that they had no right to acknowledge. Doctors and physical therapists had handled it with clinical detachment, nurses with professional efficiency, but no one had ever approached it with the kind of reverence that Zara's simple question implied. Something in her tone, in the way she waited for his response without any trace of impatience or judgment, reached past all the walls he'd built around his heart. It wasn't pity he heard in her voice, nor was it the uncomfortable mixture of curiosity and discomfort that usually accompanied people's interactions with his disability. Instead, there was something that felt almost sacred in her request, as if she understood that his wheelchair wasn't just a piece of medical equipment, but a symbol of his journey, his struggle, his adaptation to a world that had fundamentally changed. Marcus found himself nodding, though he couldn't quite explain why. The gesture felt automatic, as if his body had responded to something his mind hadn't fully processed yet. He watched as her face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire office, chasing away shadows he hadn't even realized were there. It was the kind of smile that spoke of genuine joy rather than politeness, the kind that transformed not just her features but the very atmosphere around her. Without hesitation, but with infinite care, she approached his wheelchair. Her movements were fluid and natural, displaying none of the awkwardness that usually accompanied people's first encounters with his disability. She didn't stare at the mechanisms, didn't ask uncomfortable questions about how it worked or what it felt like to use it. Instead, she simply accepted it as part of him, the way she might accept any other aspect of a new friend's appearance. She climbed onto his lap with the easy grace of a child accustomed to finding comfort wherever it was offered, her movements careful but unafraid. Her wet coat immediately began dampening his expensive Italian suit, the moisture seeping through the fine wool in a way that should have irritated him. The suit had cost more than most people earned in a month, tailored specifically to accommodate his new reality while maintaining the polished appearance expected of a CEO. But as the dampness spread across his chest, Marcus found he didn't care. There was something profound about this physical connection, this tangible proof that another human being was close enough to affect him, even in such a small way. The weight of her small body settled against him with surprising warmth, and Marcus realized it had been years since he'd held a child. Years since he'd experienced the particular kind of trust that allowed someone to curl up against him so completely. Her presence filled a void he hadn't even acknowledged. A space in his life that had been empty since his accident had driven away not just his mobility, but his connections to the simple, innocent pleasures of human contact. She opened her paper bag again and carefully unwrapped her half sandwich, the wax paper crinkling softly in the quiet office. The sound seemed amplified in the space between them, intimate and somehow precious. She examined the sandwich with the serious concentration of a chef presenting a masterpiece, then broke off a small piece and offered it to him. "Here," she said simply, holding out the morsel with the same ceremony that might accompany the sharing of communion. Mama made it this morning. Peanut butter's my favorite, but she says sharing makes everything taste better. Marcus looked down at the small piece of sandwich in her palm, at the simple bread and humble filling that represented what was probably a significant portion of this family's food budget. The contrast between this offering and the expensive lunches he usually had delivered from five-star restaurants was so stark it was almost absurd. Yet there was something about the way she offered it, something about the genuine desire to share what little she had, that made it feel like the most valuable meal he'd ever been offered. He accepted the piece and placed it in his mouth, tasting not just the simple flavors of bread and peanut butter, but something else entirely, the love with which it had been prepared. The sacrifice it represented, the hope that had carried it through rain and security checkpoints to reach this moment. It tasted like home in a way that no expensive cuisine ever had, like comfort and care and all the things his wealth had never been able to purchase. My daddy left when I was little, she said between her own bites, her voice carrying a matter-of-fact acceptance that somehow made the words even more heartbreaking. She spoke without self-pity, without the bitterness that Marcus might have expected from someone describing such a fundamental abandonment. Instead, there was simply acceptance, the kind of mature understanding that spoke of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly but had somehow managed to retain her essential innocence. Mama works 3 jobs, but we still can't afford much, she continued, her small hands gesturing as she spoke, painting pictures in the air of a life that existed in a completely different universe from Marcus's world of boardrooms and quarterly reports. She cleans offices real early in the morning, before the sun comes up. Then she works at the diner during lunch. And at night, she watches Mrs. Henderson's baby so Mrs. Henderson can work her night shift at the hospital. As she spoke, Marcus found himself drawn into her narrative, seeing through her eyes a world he'd never truly understood despite his wealth and success. He'd made charitable donations over the years, written checks to various causes, but he'd never really considered the human faces behind the statistics, the real people struggling to make ends meet in a world that seemed designed to keep them down. But you know what, she said, and her voice took on a note of wonder that seemed to transform the very air around them. Every morning she sings while making breakfast, even when she's tired, even when her feet hurt from standing all day, even when the bills are piled up on the table and she do you want know how she has gone. Nah, pay them all. She stands there at our little stove making eggs or oatmeal or whatever we got, and she sings. Zara's eyes took on a dreamy quality as she spoke, as if she were seeing her mother in that moment, hearing the songs that had apparently become the soundtrack of their struggles. She says gratitude is the only currency that never loses value, says no matter how little we got in our pockets, we always got reasons to be thankful if we just look for them. The simple wisdom of these words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was a child who had every reason to be angry at the world, every justification for bitterness and resentment, sharing the philosophy that kept her family afloat through circumstances he could barely imagine. His own struggles, significant as they felt to him, suddenly seemed different when viewed through the lens of this family's daily reality. As she spoke, Zara's small hands began to move, almost without conscious thought, finding their way to his legs. Marcus tensed for a moment, instinctively protective of the part of his body that had become a source of such pain and frustration. For 3 years, his legs had been nothing but dead weight, constant reminders of everything he'd lost, everything he could no longer do. Physical therapists had manipulated them with clinical detachment, doctors had examined them with professional interest, but no one had ever touched them with the kind of gentle curiosity that Zara displayed. Her fingers traced gentle patterns through the fabric of his expensive pants, her touch light as butterfly wings but somehow profound in its simplicity. She wasn't trying to heal him or change him, she was simply accepting him as he was, acknowledging this part of his body without judgment or pity. Her touch was that of a child exploring the world around her, finding wonder in the most unexpected places. Mama's got bad arthritis, she said softly, her fingers continuing their gentle exploration. Her hands hurt real bad, especially in the morning and when it's gonna rain. I've seen her sometimes, sitting at the kitchen table before work, just holding her hands and trying not to cry because they hurt so much. Marcus looked down at her small hands moving across his legs, struck by the parallel she was drawing without even realizing it. Here was another story of physical limitation, of pain that couldn't be cured by wishing it away or throwing money at it. But unlike his own story, this one came with a different ending. But she still braids my hair every morning, Zara continued, her voice filled with a kind of reverence that made the simple act sound like a sacred ritual. Takes her maybe 20 minutes because her fingers don't work like they used to, and I can see it hurts her. But she says love makes the pain disappear. It says when you're doing something for someone you love, your heart gets so full that there ain't room for hurting. She paused in her gentle ministrations and looked up at him, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to his soul. She says pain's just love that ain't found its purpose yet. The words settled into the quiet office like seeds finding fertile ground, taking root in places Marcus didn't even know existed within his hardened heart. He'd spent 3 years thinking of his pain as meaningless suffering, as cosmic injustice, as proof that the universe was either indifferent or actively cruel. But this child's mother, this woman he'd never met who worked 3 jobs and struggled with her own physical limitations, had found a way to transform pain into something purposeful, something that could be channeled into love and service for others. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, a sound so tangible he was surprised Zara couldn't hear it. It was the sound of a wall he'd built around his heart since the accident. A barrier constructed from bitterness and self-pity and the kind of righteous anger that came from feeling cheated by life. The crack was small at first, hairline thin, but he could feel it beginning to spread, threatening to bring down the entire structure he'd used to protect himself from further hurt. "Why did you come here?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended, thick with emotions he'd kept buried for so long they felt foreign on his tongue. Zara tilted her head, considering his question with the same serious attention she'd given everything else about their encounter. Her small hands stilled their movement across his legs, and she settled more comfortably in his lap, as if preparing for a longer conversation. "'Cause I seen you on TV," she said simply. "Was last week, I think. Mama was watching the news while she was getting ready for her evening job, and there you were, talking about some business thing I didn't understand, but you wasn't talking about business, not really." She paused, her eyes growing distant as she recalled the memory. "You looked sad, real sad, like how I felt when Daddy left. You remember that feeling? When something important goes away and leaves a hole in your chest that feels like it has never gone, fill up again." Marcus did remember that feeling, though he'd spent 3 years trying to forget it, trying to bury it under work and routine and the comfortable numbness that came from shutting out the world. The hole she described wasn't just metaphorical for him. It was a physical ache that lived in his chest, a constant reminder of everything he'd lost when his life had changed so dramatically. "I watched you on that TV," Zara continued, "and I thought, that man's got a daddy-leaving hole, just like I had. But then I learned something that maybe you ain't learned yet." She shifted in his lap, turning to face him more directly, her small hands coming up to rest gently on his chest. The gesture was so natural, so unself-conscious that Marcus felt his breath catch. When was the last time someone had touched him with such simple affection, such uncomplicated care? "But then I learned something," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a profound secret. "Sometimes being broken is just God's way of making more room for love to get in." The words hung in the air between them like a prayer, like a benediction, like a key being turned in a lock that had been sealed for far too long. Marcus felt the crack in his chest widen, felt the wall around his heart beginning to crumble in earnest. This child, who had faced abandonment and poverty and hardship beyond what most adults ever experienced, had somehow found a way to see brokenness not as a curse but as an opportunity. Her words reframed everything he thought he understood about his accident, his disability, his new reality. What if the darkness he'd been living in wasn't a punishment, but a preparation? What if the emptiness he felt wasn't meant to be filled with what he'd lost but with something entirely new? Marcus realized he was crying, and the discovery shocked him more than anything else that had happened in their encounter. These weren't the frustrated tears he'd shed in private moments of weakness, or the angry tears that had accompanied his darkest hours. These were different tears, born not from despair, but from something that felt almost like hope. They fell silently down his cheeks, warm and unexpected. The first tears he'd shed since his accident that didn't taste of bitterness. The realization that he was crying should have embarrassed him. He was Marcus Wellington, CEO of a Fortune 500 company, sitting in his executive office with tears streaming down his face, while an 8-year-old child shared her lunch with him. By any reasonable standard, the situation was absurd, but reason seemed to have very little to do with what was happening between them. This child, who had every justification for cynicism, who had been abandoned by her father and watched her mother struggle with poverty and pain, radiated a joy that Marcus had forgotten existed in the world. It wasn't naive happiness or willful blindness to life's hardships. It was something deeper, more resilient, forged in the fires of real adversity and emerging not weakened but strengthened. "What if," Zara whispered, her small voice carrying the weight of revelation, "the miracle isn't about walking again?" The question hung in the space between them, revolutionary in its simplicity. For 3 years, Marcus had defined healing in terms of restoration, of getting back what he'd lost, of returning to who he used to be. Every treatment, every therapy, every experimental procedure had been aimed at undoing the damage, at reversing the irreversible. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear as she shared what felt like the most important secret in the world. What if it's about helping others find their feet? The metaphor hit him with the force of physical impact. Finding their feet, not literally, not in the way his doctors and therapists had been trying to help him find his feet again, but metaphorically, helping others find their footing in life, their balance, their way forward when the path seemed impossible to navigate. Marcus looked down at this remarkable child in his lap, this messenger who had appeared in his office carrying nothing but half a sandwich, and wisdom that seemed to come from a source far beyond her 8 years. She had walked through rain and security checkpoints, had waited for hours for the chance to share a meal and a message that was now reshaping everything he thought. He knew about miracles, about purpose, about the possibility of transformation. For the first time since his accident, Marcus Wellington felt something stirring in his chest that wasn't pain or emptiness or bitter resignation. It was small and fragile, like a seedling pushing through cracked concrete, but it was unmistakably hope. Not hope for the return of what he'd lost, but hope for the discovery of something entirely new, something that had been waiting in the darkness for him to be ready to see it. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, but now it sounded different to Marcus's ears. Not like tears or lament, but like applause. Like nature itself celebrating this moment of connection between two broken souls, who had found in each other the missing pieces they didn't even know they'd been searching for. In the warmth of this child's presence and the wisdom of her simple words, Marcus began to understand that sometimes the greatest miracles weren't about healing what was broken, but about discovering that brokenness itself could be the beginning of something beautiful. 6 months later, the transformation was visible from every corner of the city. Where once there had been vacant lots and forgotten neighborhoods, the Wellington Foundation had sprouted like flowers after rain, bringing life and hope to places that had been written off by society. The foundation had become the city's largest youth mentorship program, but that simple description hardly captured the magnitude of what had taken root in the wake of one small girl's visit to a penthouse office. Marcus had done more than redirect half his wealth toward building community centers, funding education programs, and providing meals for families in need. He had redirected his entire philosophy of what it meant to live a meaningful life. The money had been the easy part, though even that had required courage. Writing checks, large as they were, was still familiar territory for a man who had spent decades making financial decisions. But the real challenge had been in learning how to give himself, how to invest not just his resources but his heart in the lives of others. The first community center had opened in Zara's neighborhood, a gleaming beacon of possibility where once there had been only a crumbling building that seemed to represent everything wrong with urban decay. Marcus had insisted on being present for every phase of construction, wheeling his chair through sawdust and debris, talking with workers, listening to suggestions from future users. He'd learned their names, their stories, their dreams for their children. Each conversation had been another step in his journey from isolation to connection. But the building itself, impressive as it was, with its state-of-the-art computer lab, well-stocked library, and full-service kitchen, was just the beginning. The real magic happened in the relationships that formed within its walls. Children who had never seen a future beyond their circumstances suddenly found mentors who believed in their potential. Mothers who had been working 3 jobs just to survive discovered support systems that helped them dream of something more for their families. The education programs had grown organically from conversations with parents and teachers, from understanding that children couldn't focus on learning when they were hungry, when their homes lacked quiet spaces for homework, when their families couldn't afford school supplies. What had started as simple tutoring sessions had evolved into comprehensive support systems that addressed not just academic needs but the whole child, the whole family, the whole community. The meal programs had taught Marcus more about dignity than any business school course ever could have. He learned that hungry children were unjust statistics to be fed, but human beings deserving of respect, of choices, of the kind of care that nourished souls as well as bodies. The foundation's kitchens had become gathering places where families could come together, where recipes were shared across cultural lines, where the simple act of preparing and sharing food became a form of healing. But perhaps the most profound transformation was visible in Marcus himself. The bitter, isolated man who had retreated to his penthouse fortress had been replaced by someone unrecognizable, yet somehow more authentically himself than he had ever been. His office relocation to ground level hadn't been just about accessibility, though that mattered. It had been about accessibility of a different kind, about removing the physical and psychological barriers that had separated him from the people he now served. The open-door policy had been Zara's suggestion, offered during one of their Tuesday afternoon sessions when she'd observed that important people in tall buildings seemed awfully far away from the problems they were trying to solve. "How are you going to know what folks need if they can't reach you?" she'd asked with her characteristic directness. The question had prompted Marcus to redesign not just his office space, but his entire approach to leadership. Now, instead of marble floors and intimidating heights, his office occupied the ground floor of the main community center, its large windows, looking out onto a playground where children laughed and played, where teenagers gathered after school, where elderly residents sat on benches sharing stories and watching the world go by. The expensive artwork and formal furniture had been replaced with comfortable seating areas, walls covered with children's drawings and photos from community events, and a coffee station that was always available for visitors. Every Tuesday, without fail, Zara visited his office. The ritual had begun as a way for Marcus to tutor her in mathematics, a subject she struggled with despite her obvious intelligence. But over the months, their sessions had evolved into something much richer. A mutual exchange that taught both of them lessons that couldn't be found in any textbook. She would arrive precisely at 4 o'clock, her backpack slung over one shoulder, often carrying small treasures she'd discovered during her walk from school. An interesting leaf, a smooth stone, once a tiny kitten she de-rescued from a storm drain and successfully convinced her mother to let her keep. These offerings had become as much a part of their routine as the homework spread across his desk. Marcus had discovered that helping an 8-year-old with multiplication tables required a different kind of patience than he'd ever needed in boardroom negotiations. When Zara struggled with a concept, he couldn't simply power through with determination or delegate the problem to someone else. He had to find new ways to explain, to connect mathematical concepts to things she understood, to celebrate small victories and gently encourage her through frustrations. In return, she shared stories that opened windows into worlds he was still learning to understand. She told him about her friends at school, their dreams and fears, their families' struggles and celebrations. She described her mother's continuing challenges with 3 jobs and arthritis, but also her growing hope as community programs began to ease some of the financial pressure. She painted pictures with words of a neighborhood in transition, of how the new community center had become a gathering place that was slowly but surely changing the social fabric of her world. Mr. Marcus just said one Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, her math homework forgotten as she looked up at him with those wise eyes that never failed to see straight to the heart of things. "You're walking now." He looked down at his wheelchair, confused and slightly hurt. After all their time together, after all the progress in their relationship, was she still focused on his disability? Had he misunderstood the depth of their connection? "Zara, I'm still," he began, his voice carrying a note of disappointment he couldn't quite hide. "Not with your legs," she interrupted, her tone carrying the gentle patience of a teacher correcting a slow student. Her eyes were twinkling with the kind of joy that came from sharing a profound truth with someone who was finally ready to hear it. "With your heart, you're walking into people's lives and making them better. That's the kind of walking that really matters." The words hit him with the same transformative power as that first encounter 6 months earlier. She was right, of course. He was walking in ways he had never walked before his accident. His legs might be still, but he was moving through the world with a purpose and energy that his formerly able-bodied self had never possessed. He was walking into grocery stores to understand food insecurity, walking into schools to see educational challenges firsthand, walking into family homes to witness both struggles and strengths he had never imagined. More than that, he was walking into hearts that had been closed by disappointment, into dreams that had been deferred by circumstance, into hopes that had been all but abandoned by systems that had failed them. His wheelchair, rather than being a symbol of limitation, had become his vehicle for a kind of mobility that transcended physical movement. The months that followed were a whirlwind of expansion and deepening connection. The Wellington Foundation's programs multiplied and evolved, always guided by the principles Zara had taught him. That real change happened not through grand gestures but through consistent presence, through showing up day after day, through listening more than speaking, through learning to see miracles in small moments. The Foundation's first annual gala had been planned as a fundraising event, but as the date approached, Marcus realized it had become something much more significant. It was a celebration of transformation, not just for the communities they served, but for everyone involved in the work. Board members who had joined expecting typical charity obligations found themselves personally invested in individual stories. Donors who had written checks from a distance discovered the joy of hands-on involvement. Volunteers who had expected to give their time found they were receiving far more than they gave. The venue chosen for the gala was not a fancy hotel ballroom but the gymnasium of the first community center, decorated with artwork created by program participants and filled with roundtables that mixed donors, beneficiaries, volunteers, and board members in a way that would have been unthinkable at Marcus's previous charitable events. The evening was designed to be not a showcase of wealth but a celebration of community, not a performance for donors but a genuine gathering of people whose lives had become intertwined through shared purpose. As the evening approached, Marcus found himself experiencing a nervousness he hadn't felt since his early days in business. This wasn't about impressing investors or closing deals. This was about sharing something deeply personal with people who had become in ways he was still learning to understand. His family. The speech he had prepared and discarded multiple times wasn't a presentation to an audience but a letter to friends, an attempt to put into words a transformation that still amazed him daily. The day of the gala arrived, crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made everything seem possible. Marcus arrived early, wanting to oversee final preparations, but mostly needing to be in the space, to absorb the energy of all the hands working together to create something beautiful. Community members, foundation staff, volunteers, and even some of the teenagers from the program were all involved in setup, their laughter and easy conversation creating an atmosphere of joy that no professional event planner could have manufactured. As the guests began to arrive, Marcus positioned himself near the entrance, greeting each person individually. He had learned from Zara the importance of seeing people, of acknowledging their presence, of making everyone feel valued and welcome. The handshakes and hugs, the stories shared in brief encounters, the introductions between people from different worlds, all of it felt like a living testament to what was possible when barriers were removed and hearts were opened. When the time came for his keynote address, Marcus wheeled himself onto the small stage that had been constructed at one end of the gymnasium. The spotlight found him there, but instead of feeling isolated or exposed, he felt connected to every person in the room. These weren't strangers evaluating his performance. These were people who had become part of his story, just as he had become part of theirs. He looked out over the audience, his eyes finding familiar faces throughout the room. There was Mrs. Johnson, Zara's mother, wearing a dress that Marcus knew had been carefully chosen for this special evening, her arthritis temporarily forgotten in her pride and joy. There were teenagers from the mentorship program, some of whom had been scholarship recipients to attend the event, their faces glowing with the kind of hope that came from believing their futures held unlimited possibilities. And in the front row, exactly where he had known she would be, sat Zara. She was wearing a new dress, a beautiful blue creation that her mother had spent weeks saving to purchase. But clutched in her arms was her worn teddy bear, the same constant companion she had carried through all their Tuesday afternoon sessions. The juxtaposition of new and old, of celebration and comfort, of growth and continuity, seemed to perfectly capture everything this evening represented. A year ago, a little girl asked to trade her leftovers for my miracle, Marcus began, his voice steady and warm, carrying easily throughout the gymnasium that had fallen completely silent. The opening line had the same power it had carried in his office that rainy day, but now it was spoken not in bitterness but with profound gratitude. I thought she was naive, he continued, his eyes finding Zara's and holding them. I thought miracles were about changing what's broken in our bodies. I had spent 3 years believing that healing meant going backwards, returning to who I used to be, undoing the damage that had been done to me. He paused, letting the weight of that confession settle over the audience. Many of them knew his story by now, had heard pieces of it in smaller gatherings, but this was the first time he had shared it so publicly, so completely. But she taught me that miracles are about healing what's broken in our souls, he said, and his voice carried the wonder of someone still amazed by this discovery. She showed me that sometimes the things we think have destroyed us have actually prepared us for our real purpose. The audience was completely still, every person leaning forward slightly, drawn into the intimacy of his words despite the size of the gathering. This was not the polished presentation of a CEO addressing shareholders. This was the raw honesty of a human being sharing the most important lesson of his life. He gestured toward Zara, his movement encompassing not just her but her mother, the community members scattered throughout the audience, everyone whose lives had intersected with his through the Foundation's work. She gave me half a sandwich and an apple that day, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The simplest possible meal, offered by someone who had every reason to keep what little she had for herself. The image hung in the air, and Marcus could see people throughout the audience nodding, remembering their own encounters with unexpected generosity, their own moments when someone with very little had offered them everything. In return, I gave her everything, he said, spreading his arms wide to encompass not just the room but the entire network of programs and relationships that had grown from that single encounter. Because that's what happens when someone shows you that the greatest wealth isn't in what you have but in what you give away. The truth of this statement was visible everywhere in the room. Volunteers who had discovered that serving others filled voids in their own lives they had even known existed. Donors who had found that their most meaningful investments weren't in stock portfolios but in human potential. Community members who had learned that their own struggles could become sources of strength and wisdom for others, facing similar challenges. I used to think that losing the use of my legs was the worst thing that could happen to me, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he approached the heart of his message. I spent 3 years mourning what I had lost, raging against the unfairness of it, trying desperately to get back to who I used to be. He paused, looking out over faces that reflected understanding, compassion, their own struggles with loss and disappointment, and the challenge of finding meaning in suffering. But Zara helped me understand something that changed everything, he said, his eyes finding hers again across the crowded room. Sometimes we must lose everything to discover that we had everything we needed all along: the capacity to love, to serve, and to transform pain into purpose. As he spoke these words, Marcus felt the truth of them resonating not just in his own heart but throughout the room. This was the miracle he had been seeking all along. Not the restoration of what had been taken from him but the discovery of what had been there all the time, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to be shared. The miracle was never about me walking again, he concluded, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had found his true path. It was about learning to lift others up, one small act of kindness at a time. The silence that followed his final words was profound, the kind of hush that comes when people recognize they have been in the presence of something sacred. Then, slowly, one person began to clap, then another. Within moments, the entire gymnasium had erupted in thunderous applause. But this wasn't the polite appreciation typically offered at such events. This was the sound of recognition, of shared understanding, of hearts that had been touched and transformed. As the audience rose to their feet, Marcus looked out over the celebration and understood with perfect clarity the profound truth Zara had brought to his life. The applause wasn't for him. It was for all of them, for what they had built together, for what they had discovered. about the power of human connection to heal wounds that seemed unhealable and to create hope where none had existed before. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth and energy of hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by one small girl's wisdom, Marcus Wellington finally understood that miracles weren't supernatural events that defied the laws of nature. They were the perfectly natural result of love being allowed to flow freely from heart to heart, transforming everything in its path and creating something beautiful from the broken pieces of human experience.